I just wanted to share a little bit about myself for those of you who don't know me. My name again is Mara Walsh. I am in the United States and specifically between Philadelphia and New York on the East Coast. I started leading physical tours with EF Tours as a Girl Scout leader, taking girls and their families to international destinations every summer. I have since expanded my physical travel program. Now I also lead adult-only tours with EF Go Ahead Tours, as well as several other tour organizations. I also offer family-friendly tours, which include mostly from the ages of teens through senior citizens. And as a certified travel agent, I can also book you on a dream trip as part of a group or on your own. If you are starting to think about physical travel again and you need some assistance, just reach out to me and I will be sure to find you the best fit that is out there. In terms of the virtual tours, there's a couple reasons why I started this series way back in April of 2020. I really wanted to support the tour director community during this time of travel restrictions where they have not been able to work. And I also really wanted to keep the excitement of travel alive for my travel group and extend that opportunity to those of you who've learned about us through your friends, your family, and on social media. So welcome everyone. We've done about 50 tours in the last year since COVID has struck. If you'd like to access any of the recordings to the virtual tour presentations, you can do that on my website, which is girltraveltours.com. There is a virtual tour drop-down menu, which gives you access to all of the recordings. You can also sign up for future tours that we will be having in the upcoming months. And I'm going to share a screen with you, which gives you a rundown of the tours that we have and you can register for right now. Next week, we're going to Patagonia. We're doing Brittany and Mont Saint-Michel. We're doing Victorian London, Yellowstone National Park, Communism in the Eastern Bloc, Salzburg, Sound and Music Tour, Milan, Mystery in Transylvania, right around Halloween, Northern Spain, and Victoria Falls, Zimbabwe. We also have some more coming up throughout the winter, so you can check back often as we add new destinations all the time. As long as you're interested in viewing these virtual tour presentations, we will continue to produce them for you. I know many of you have found me and my virtual tours through Facebook, and I know some of you are live streaming us on Facebook right now. I just wanted to throw a shout out there. You should not have paid for the access to this tour. If you did pay to get the link for this tour, you have been scammed, I'm sorry to say, but you should contact your credit card company or PayPal or Facebook, however you paid, and you should dispute that charge because these tours are free to attend. It is up to you after the tour. If you wish to tip the tour director, that is on you, but you should not have been charged for access. So please know that my tours are free to attend. And in the future, if you want to safely attend our tours, you can always do so through my website, which is girltraveltours.com. So again, if you did pay for entry to this tour, please go and dispute that. That is a wrongful charge. And there are people out there that are scamming people into paying, and then they provide you with my free link, which is just horrible in so many ways. The only way for us to combat this is to educate people and also to report them to Facebook. So keep reporting them and keep sharing this information with others so that we get fewer and fewer and fewer people scammed each week. Okay, before we get going, I wanted to share with you a few ways that you can interact with us during this event. One, feel free to ask questions about the tour director, and my travel program by using the Q&A on the Zoom toolbar. We will address those questions at the end of the tour, and we'll go over them live. If you have something to say to me, you can do it in the chat, and I will try to respond to those of you that are commenting in the chat and also the live stream on Facebook. I always like to include an interactive poll as well with our virtual tour presentations. My mouse is actually a little stuck right now, so I'm trying desperately to go over to the poll. May not let me. Here we go. We're going to go to the poll. I'm going to launch the poll. And I'm going to launch this poll, and essentially it is, what is your connection to New England? I've been and love it. I have a trip booked. I plan to go in the future. I have no set plans, but I'm interested in the location, or I am solely interested in experiencing it virtually. I'm going to give you a little bit of time for you to answer the poll question. It looks like many of us have been there and loved it. So I'm going to end the poll, and I'm going to share the results. And it looks like about 58 or 60% have been and loved it. And then there was the next big chunk of people are about 20% that have no set plans, but are interested in the location. And I bet you, if our tour director does a great job on this tour, those statistics will change and the people will move up to, I have plans in the future. That happens to us week after week. And sorry to say, it happens to me all of the time, because I go through these virtual tours every week with the guides, and my bucket list has grown so long that I think I'll be traveling from now until eternity when COVID is finally over and the travel restrictions have lifted. Okay, today's tour and all of our tours are scheduled for 90 minutes plus the Q&A. So I hope you're ready with a snack and a drink in hand. I say this every week, and I'm going to keep saying it, that a tour would not be complete without a fantastic tour director. A tour director is someone who is with your group from start to finish. They are like a travel concierge. They manage your tour from the aspect of sharing a world of knowledge. They manage the travel plans. They make sure your experience is full of education, that your experience is stressless, and it's easy to navigate. These are by far the most important people in a group tour. I'll share with you via chat and during the Q&A how you can tip the tour director if you are so inclined. And all the tips go directly to the guide once collected, minus the Zoom operating expenses. I'm hoping that this virtual tour will not only keep our desire for travel alive until it is possible for us to once again travel, God willing, but also allow a tour director to do what he does best, which is share his knowledge and passion for travel. Today, we're lucky to have back Patrick. He's coming back with us. In normal times, Patrick takes groups on this tour throughout New England several times a year. So today, we get to see his tour via this virtual presentation. So if you're ready, Patrick, you can come on and join me virtually, and I will hand over the controls to you, and you can start to share your screen.
There we go. I'm just sharing now. Let me see. Whoops, there we are. Don't know why I've gotten that one up there, Mara, but I'm just going to pull this one up. There we are.
You got it.
Good stuff. Hey, thank you. I'm on, Mara. Can you hear me just fine?
You are good. You're good to go.
Perfect. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. And I think on behalf of all of us in this worldwide network of tour guides and tour directors and so forth, we'd like to offer, and really a heartfelt thank you to Mara. I've gradually, and we were talking, well, we've become friends, but beforehand, I've transitioned, of course, to living this sort of virtual life, but Mara's made an incredible difference to all of us. And I'm now doing all sorts of virtual presentations, but this is all, I mean, really is exciting because it is, I feel like I'm part of a broader family, and I hope you all are too. I think the other thing that Mara has achieved and other people have followed with is that this virtual experience is accessible to everyone. So yes, we love to travel. We love to be able to travel. But for those who are not in a position to do so, this is another way to connect. And I hope this stays with us forever. A couple of other just small technical things. I saw one person put in a comment, said there's a bad echo. Mara will tell me if my connection's not great, but I'm downstairs in my house and I have a good connection here. So if you're getting a bad echo, it's almost as if perhaps you have two devices on or you need headphones or something like that. A little bit more about myself. You will note that I do not have a New England accent, although I can do my best. I am sitting here, and I saw a lot of Canadians signing on. I live in Banff National Park in the Canadian Rockies. I am from the Canadian Rockies. I have been guiding tours around the world one way or another for about 25 years. And Mara and I sort of connected because I began guiding through the EF family. And in fact, I have tours lined up in September and October with Go Ahead and everything, and with EF, and we'll see should that come around. But over the years, I have actually run, well, in different styles and forms, I will have run, if I were to pick a number, 24 tours to what falls under New England as a catchment. Quite often I would do a tour that would start in Boston, go up north, up to Montreal, down to Toronto, and then drop back into New York and down to New York City, for example. But I have twice run a specific tour called the 6 States of New England. In fact, I helped set it up it was a different company, but I've done that, and I've run specific tours to Cape Cod. So I have both a relationship with New England and I think a general love for it. When Mara reached out to me about this subject, we thought trying to cover New England, and I know there's people here from New Hampshire and Boston and so forth. I'm not sitting here as a tour guide, tour director. I'm a historian by background, but I'm not sitting here to tell you about you. I'm sitting here to talk about sort of a macro vision of how one might visit the 6 states. And of course, if you think of a typical tour of being 10 to 14 days, I mean, that's a reality. So what we decided is that we pick a highlight in each state. And in the chat, in the Q&A at the end, I'm more than happy to talk about your favorites. But I probably could have picked a secondary favorite in each state, but I thought we'd go along here because I've broken it into the 6 states. We do a general introduction. I thought we'd spend 10 minutes or so on each state, and then we can move on to a Q&A. I am not pretending to be the oracle of everything about New England or the world, but I am at least a person who has spent a huge amount of time traveling the world. Sorry, I was just moving that over. And I love that part of the world. I'm just trying to move. There we are. I wanted to move this far, just in my way. There we are. So, I was doing my best start with, I did red, white, and blue because, New England is incredibly patriotic, and it's beautiful, and it's interesting, and it's diverse. And so if we talk about New England and Old England, the parallels are actually fairly reasonable. If you're talking about 72,000 square miles, they're in what constitutes the 6 states, or England itself, 51,000. But once you put in Scotland and Wales, sort of Great Britain, it's a fairly equivalent size, right? Only about 15 million people in New England, whereas England alone is over 50 million, 56, and the UK is about 63 million. We understand that there was a migration over into the Americas. New England was not by any stretch the absolute first settlement. And in fact, we're going to start up in Maine and Acadia, and that's Samuel de Champlain, which is French in terms of European settlement. But there were a whole series of indigenous groups who lived, of course, up and down that coast, both inland and on the coast. I know we understand that, but I think it's very important to acknowledge it. And those names, this funny confluence of very, very Englishy names, and then indigenous names like Connecticut and Massachusetts and so forth. And then even the French influence, Acadia, coming in. That's part of the mosaic that creates New England as we understand it. So I think it's fun just to have a little comparison there. So yeah, 14.8, 15 million people will call it. So Boston, which is a city I love. And I very intentionally stayed away from Boston. I think that deserves its own story, its own tour, its own conversation. This is very typical of a tour. Unless you're driving up from New York or something on a trip into New England, if you're flying in, if you're coming from abroad, then you're going to probably start at Boston Logan's Airport, which incidentally, I really like. People criticize it with the international terminal, and I have many times stood there holding a sign to meet groups from wherever, And the international terminal is quiet and friendly, and people wander out and say hello. And now Boston is, I mean, among the most educated and attractive cities, I think, anywhere, certainly in the Americas. Somehow all the brains in all those universities haven't been applied to traffic, which is a factor. But as you see how much green is around, so there's greater Boston, and then there's New England, and it's almost a tale of two stories, that incredible rocky coast, and then you move into the green hills of it. If you think about New York, which of course is just on the bottom of the map here. So New York City, if you Google it, says 8.5 million, but we all know it's a lot more than that. You know, it's a much bigger place. And that's a huge, massive population that happens down around that side of the world. Sorry, I keep keeping my eye on my my phone just for my timer. But there is one of the overviews. And this is this macro sense. And I could actually be showing a picture of all of North America from about the middle of the United States north. So the Great Lakes, of course, you're looking at the largest body of fresh water in the world. Well, it's only about 11,000 years ago that the glaciers retreat. And I explain this so often when I talk about North American history everywhere. But to understand the Americas in terms of European settlement and even indigenous travel, native travel across the continents, you need to understand the place first by water, then by train, then by car, and then by plane. And of course, so often when it freezes, by dog sled or some other version. And so when we look at New England itself, it's quite easy. And I've got this great big cursor right. It's very easy. We shouldn't separate New England from what is now New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. That's all the Acadian coast there. But this is where both the French and then the British and a series of other settlers came down. And this is also where indigenous people, for quantifiably 13 or 14,000 years, lived off the land. You really need to get up into Vermont and the north here on the border with New York, where you get the drainage into the St. Lawrence. So, and this is one of the unique features about New England. If you're coming into our continent, you'd come in through the St. Lawrence, or you came in through the Mississippi, or of course the Columbia River way out in the west. And eventually canals were built that created Canada, created Upper New York, industrial. But so much of New England was actually directly connected to the ocean, and that is whaling and trade, and some pretty ugly trade too. But that's just a broad introduction to what is now New England. The glaciers retreated and they left behind them, because it's very old granite rock, very old, much different from, say, the Rockies in the west. And as the glaciers sheared them off, you're left with these rolling hills right up to the beautiful White Mountains, and then the drainage into the St. Lawrence Basin. So it's this large ridge of mountains, but this sort of forested, rocky land that's either connected to the Atlantic Ocean or inland. So that's just a general introduction. It doesn't really stop at Connecticut, but there is a real transition in the landscape through there. So that's just your basic New England. Now, again, because we picked a spot in each state, we're not out. I'm not out to tell you the story of everyone. Everyone deserves a tour unto themselves. But let's start with Maine, right? Obviously, the extreme northeast of the United States. It's the biggest state in New England by far, but 1.3 million people is not particularly large. In fact, as a side note, New England, aside from perhaps Massachusetts, because that is a bigger population, but Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, they play very important roles in American politics, because each one has 2 senators. And you probably remember in the last election, national election, huge debate over the senator being elected from Maine. And as they say, all politics are local. But Maine is big and beautiful. The capital is Augusta right here. Bangor is where Stephen King lives and writes all sorts of horrible novels. One of the lovely statistics I like is way up here. Do you see Edmundston? That's New Brunswick. and that's Les Acadiens. So the Acadians, hence Acadia National Park, just across these communities down here. This area and Louisiana are the two places in the United States where you have a fairly dominant French-speaking population. Why do I mention Portland? A, because Portland is just a remarkably attractive city. It's really only a few hours, about 3 from Boston. I like everything about Portland, but it was once upon a time, they said as many bars as people, and it was the first place to have a go at Prohibition, and therefore the first place to have a real go at bootleggers. So people had boots and would pull out booze, right? So when you come up the coast, but what I wanted to touch on when I come to Maine is right down here is the most easterly and first United States national park east of the Mississippi, Acadia National Park. So Samuel de Champlain saw this area, came and fixed his ships here. Acadia means Acadian. It comes from the name Les Acadiens because it was the Acadian coast. Keep in mind, if you're vaguely aware of this history, in the 1750s, there were the so-called French and Indian Wars. Keep in mind, these were all the colonies. Nova Scotia was Acadia. New Brunswick didn't exist. And then Maine, you had the 13 colonies down the coast. And the British in 1755 decide to expel the Acadians, expel the French. Now, not all left, but they left and went down the coast. No one would let them land. And eventually they went to Louisiana, which was a French holding. And so the name Acadian became Cajun. So that's that connection. And Maine, again, with a small population, still has, a predominant French, and it's obtuse to call it French Canadian. It's a French North American tradition. But this is very interesting. And it's just a theme I would like to touch back on when we get to Rhode Island. But so the actual National Park of Acadia is, I think, about 105 years old now. So about 1916, it gets set aside. But this is a place that the Rothschilds would take their holidays. And they have these wonderful cart paths that go all through. All right, so it's a massive area. So it's 47,000 acres, but I think there's 49,000 or something of paths that come through. It is technically an island, tiny peninsula, and you have gorgeous Bar Harbor down there. But the park was created honestly by endowment of this elite of 100 years ago. Now, as a point of reflection, it is interesting to me that the world, well, the North American context has reverted to now some form of dependence again on the ultra rich being benevolent. So it's just a comment that I think is worth mentioning. So the Rothschild family would come up here. They felt it was worth protecting. I agree entirely. It is a beautiful area. So it is a bit like where I live in here in Banff, where you actually have some community or infrastructure within a national park because there was life there before the park was set aside. Now, getting up to Acadia is a bit of a haul. It's an effort to get here. Many people call in by cruise ships, and you see cruise ships sitting out in the harbor all the time. Ahaba is a few thousand people. It is charming and fantastic, and the food is delicious. And there are still people today. In fact, you can take lobster tours out, which you can do, of course, all over New England. But it is a gorgeous place, and it has the 500 meters, so 1,600 foot Cadillac Mountain, which doesn't sound that high. Oh, there we are. But it sees the first, for 6 months of the year, it's the first sunrise of any point in the continental United States. In fact, that mountain there is the highest point from the Cape Breton Highlands down to Rio de Janeiro on the Atlantic coast. So the foresight to say this deserves protecting is fantastic. Now, remember as best you can this spectacular coastline here, because it is gorgeous. It's great for fishing, but it's not an easy coastline. It's not an easy place to navigate. And so they'd have to call in. really until you get further south and the harbors become more obvious, which is why Boston is where it is. Now, I have to say, just as a tiny shout out, I did spend money to buy some photos because of copyright. And of course, I haven't been able to travel for, well, coming up year and 2 quarters. But this is me doing a handstand on Cadillac Mountain because I had to do it. And it's beautiful lobster bisque. When I get back to New England, and anyone who's in that part of the world, I have a lobster roll, a lobster bisque, an IPA, and then I'm full for 4 days. In fact, I've worn this shirt for the second time, I think, in my life. It was given to me as a gift, and I'm trying to look as New Englandy as I can. But Bar Harbor is a place that, as a mountain kid, feels like home. And they do whale watching. You get humpbacks, but you also get some of the rare, larger whales. So it's spectacular. So that's that national park. It's well worth the effort to go into Maine to touch that. And so that's the spot I'm picking in Maine, is my hello to Maine. We could pick lots of others, but it's lovely. You drive straight up to Bangor and then down to Augusta, or you follow the coast through Belfast and down to Portland to get there. There's Bar Harbor. Of course, the autumn colors are spectacular. We have to talk about autumn colors in New England, but as a shout out to all my friends who have tourism businesses in New England, yes, the colors are spectacular. You pick up your leaf guide, but you don't have to just go through leaf time. Winter is gorgeous. Spring is a time when I can actually visit New England without being crowded. So, but there it is. I'll be very sympathetic though. When you go to the lovely hotels in Bar Harbor, don't be surprised if you find the service so. Many kids who basically run them are on 4-month work visas, because that's basically the tourist period. But it's lovely, and it's that rounded heart. So that is a post-glacial maple forest. So we're going to move on. So let's pretend we've driven all the way from Bar Harbor. You can do it in a day. I often stay in this town of Bethel, by the way. There's a ski hill and a golf course there, and family-run hotels, which are just, it's just so wonderfully New England, because you arrive there and the owners come out to greet you. But I wanted to come into little New Hampshire again, 1.3 million. So about the same as Maine, right? They call it the Granite State, and it's aptly named. And it, of course, is home to Mount Washington, which is about 6,280, 6,300 feet. But for the many Americans who are on board, as New Hampshire goes, so does the nation. The early primaries, it plays this massive political role. New Hampshire is not landlocked, see? And I've spent time down in Portsmouth. The largest city is Manchester and the capital is Concord, but there's beautiful little New Hampshire. But I wanted to focus on this area because how do you not? Now, Franconia Notch State Park. Franconia is a region of southern Germany and Switzerland. It was named after that because they felt there was a familiarity. But you might remember this. You might remember the coin, the American 25 cents, that has this face on it, and that is the Old Man on the Mountain. So that actually fell off in 1983. It was going to, that's not any terrible environmental thing. That is the freeze and thaw. Granite creates cracks, water freezes, it expands, and they do have genuine harsh winters there. This is on the western side of the White Mountains. But it is one of those iconic American images that are well worth the effort to look at and know. And so I still love driving up that interstate, because depending on which tour I'm doing, and the one I'm talking about, the 6 states, I'm coming in from Maine, but other times I'm heading up through this region and then carrying on up, well, eventually to Montreal on that one. But that White Mountains is a wonderful treat. When you do arrive in New Hampshire, you stop at the port of entry, particularly if you're coming from Massachusetts, and you can buy liquor. The government owns liquor, and it's a huge part. There's no state tax, so a huge part of their economy. So don't drink and drive. But you might recognize this. I felt I had to put it in. So in terms of the route I'm taking, is I'm coming from the east and I'm winding my way down. We're moving towards Kancamangas, the famous highway that actually connected North Conway to Bath, but really is this one journey right through the middle of the southern middle of the White Mountains. This is why you'd be interested to go anywhere in that region, but winter is beautiful and appealing. That, if you don't recognize it, but I'm sure you do, even if you've never been anywhere in the region, but that is the Mount Washington Hotel. It was built 1900 to 1902. There is Mount Washington behind, the highest mountain, of course, in the Northeast, right? So it's the biggest one in the whole structure we have there. And 6,200 feet's not nothing. It has a significant prominence. And there is actually a cog railway up to the top, which I've been on once. And it was nice, just burns up a lot of the day. The fall colors are spectacular, but winter, look at that. And it shows you how scoured those mountains had been in the post-glacial period, because these aren't that high, yet you're far enough inland that you have a fairly low tree line there, right? There are a few more that climb up bushes, the sumacs and so forth, but pretty spectacular. Now, why this hotel matters, why it's worth going there, is that was in 1944, Bretton Woods. Let's give you a minute to remember that. Bretton Woods happens at the, well, not the end of World War II, but that was a big meeting and it took 3 weeks. That is why we have the financial institutions that we do now on planet Earth. So that's the International Monetary Fund that leads to the Marshall Plan. That is how business or financial institutions internationally were structured in one fell swoop collectively. So that's really important. There are several ways to get up there on the journey, and I don't want to keep coming back map after map, but when I get here from Maine, they're lovely country trails. When I come up from the south, I'll detour because you can't miss Mount Washington, and it is beautiful. And there's Kancamangas Highway. So North Conway, there's a famous train there, and I highly recommend staying in North Conway. But the Kank, as they call it, is lovely. I'll tell you one little side story though, because generally when I've run tours, I have run the big 6 states in spring, but so often I've done New England in the fall, which totally understandable, but busy. But normally I'm always a huge fan of tour coaches. A tour coach is better than, say, I have 40 people. It's better than 20 automobiles, right? Just environmentally and socially and everything. I once pulled on a weekend when the leaves had erupted. They popped, as they say, and I couldn't pull in. I mean, I literally drove the 32 miles. It was gorgeous, as slow as you could. I really couldn't make a stop. In fact, so much so I detoured the next morning really early. I can't accept anyone who has the energy to get up at 6 a.m. will head out. But it's a beautiful drive, and it's a remarkably young road, built in 1959 and not paved till 1964. And it connects over to the Notch, the Old Man, just beyond Lincoln, and by the Flume Gorge. I'm sure some of you know that, to North Conway on the other side. There are valleys either side, and you have these white mountains in between. Obviously not always white. Skiing in the area, but it is just the sheer beauty of that granite and those huge deciduous forests. So there is very late in the year, and I have had the honor of seeing it in this sort of condition. So, you're not very high up in elevation, but it means that you have these rich deciduous forests and then these snowy peaks around. So I'm personally extremely taken by the area. I find it fun and beautiful and so much to explore from both sides, and really from the top. And then when you get to the south, you get down to Concord, which is on a lake, the capital, and that's really gorgeous. And then you move into sort of more maritime New England, right, which you do still have in New Hampshire, in Portsmouth, and then Rockport, Massachusetts, but that little corner. But anyway, just a beautiful place to visit. Cover bridges, of course, are endemic. This one is just in photos all the time. There's 3 that I know of in the area, and probably more. These go back, of course, to colonial times. And it is interesting. I mean, why do you need a covered bridge? Well, you do get ice jams, and one must never forget winter. You're inland enough, it's cold enough. I think another exception between New England and England is England or the UK have that very temperate Gulf Stream. New England is sheltered by a continent, and so it has a very, very distinct summer and a very distinct winter. And so those are different effects. But the covered bridges are always a treat to see. There are some you can still drive over. They tend to be one-way traffic. And it is testament, I mean, the photos always have the beautiful blue sky, but it's testament that a heavy, heavy snow falls as well, which play into the story. So I put these two in, these are older photos of mine that pulled up. I'll show you a map in a second. But once you go past Franconia and the Notch and the Flume Gorge, you've come across from North Conway, across those 32 miles, you turn north and you get up to Littleton, New Hampshire. If you have at least a spare hour, Littleton's a must. And this is, it claims to be the longest candy counter in the world. So it's just kind of fun. Littleton, and it's been a couple of years, of course it's been a couple of years since I've been there, but they had pianos everywhere and an old mill, outdoor pianos everyone can play. So I'm just very taken by Littleton. You're moving into old lumber industry, these mill towns, but once again, that wooden charm that defines so much of New England. You head down the road to Lisbon, which is gorgeous, and then you cross in to Vermont. And when you do so, you get to this tiny town of Bath. And the fellow who's either associated or owns this brick store once played with the Beatles. But the brick store is the United States' oldest general store. It was under renovations last time I was there, but it was still open. There's and I looked for a photo and I couldn't find one of the old covered bridge beside it, but it is honestly an old bend in the road. And of course, when you see these older towns, which you don't see necessarily in the rest of North America, there's the bend in the town and then a little traffic island. And they call them rotaries, of course, in Massachusetts. But that's because they were designed in the horse-drawn era. And I mean, this is a function of New England as it dates back far enough that it's not necessarily the modern grid formation. So that's just part of the fun of the drive. And so that leads us in to beautiful Vermont. Now, Vermont, everything about Vermont is interesting. So I hope you find it interesting. The second smallest state in the Union. I know we're not chatting back and forth. I don't know if anyone off the top of their head knows the smallest state by population, but that's Wyoming. But this is the one landlocked New England state, the Green Mountain State. When you drive through Vermont, which is pretty easy, 91 comes down, 89 comes down, right? One line down here. When you come down, one thing you will notice that is quite distinct from a lot of other places is you don't have those big advertising billboards, right? So it really is this rolling green, and it's beautiful, and it's full of little superlatives. Of course, it's distinctly political, but Burlington up here is the smallest, largest city in a state. And ready for this? Montpelier, but named after Montpellier in France. Montpellier with two L's, Montpelier with one, is the smallest state capital by population. I just thought I'd mention because, of course, when you get up to the top here, once you pop through the border on 89, you're only 45 minutes from Montreal. And Montreal's big. I mean, Montreal's 4 million, the second largest French-speaking city in the world. So signs become bilingual up here. And actually, the Green Mountains are about here. And then they flatten out. And that's because this drainage from Lake Champlain, Samuel de Champlain, drains up into the St. Lawrence Seaway, the St. Lawrence River and system, fluvial is what we would call it technically. And of course, you're probably familiar with Stowe, right? So Stowe is famous for skiing and very outdoorsy. And of course, however you feel politically about them, but Ben and Jerry's started up there in Stowe. Again, I love Stowe. I think it's a really neat place, but the old narrow winding roads on leafy weekends in the fall, you can be 45 minutes to drive in, but it's one of your classic images of the churches. Now, the Vermont Canada movement, the reason I mention all that is this has nothing to do with recent political. It was actually after George Bush won his second. You might, of course, I always mention Burlington because of Bernie Sanders, right? That's very, well, he's from New York, but Long Island, but, or Brooklyn, I think, but, represents Vermont. They actually started a movement. Why did they start a movement? Well, notice this point. It's the 14th colony. And so this was the first place. Vermont was one of 4 independent states that chose to join the United States. So the US creates itself around 13 colonies. We all know this history. Vermont's the first one to say it's going to sign on. Technically, according to its constitution, it has the right to sign out. And after the second election of George W. Bush, there was this movement saying, and it was actually in conjunction with equal marriage, which in Canada, of course, predates most other countries aside from Belgium and Holland by a decade, saying that they shared those principles and wanted to join Canada. Now, it hasn't turned into much, but feel free to Google the Vermont Canada movement. So, but it is a sparsely populated, landlocked New England state with its own identity, absolutely. And, if one's going to have a little bit of a laugh, though, they generally, not totally, they tend to resist big box stores, but they can always just jump over the border into New Hampshire. So I always think that's sort of fun. But there it is, Montpelier. So it's, I think it's under 7,000 people. No, under 8,000. I think about 7,800 people. That's the capital. I have been there, honestly, 24 times. And every single time I love it. I once had, it happened to be a British group, but I had someone walk up to me after sort of lunchtime saying, well, what are we doing tomorrow? There's nothing to see here. And I'm like, well, you've come to the wrong place because there's a ton to see here. Right? Of course, every single early city inland is built along water. And of course, you had to extract water. And once again, remember, it's all hard granite. So it's not porous rock. You're not extracting a lot of water. Now you're going down to get the water. But here's the state house. I believe, unless it's changed, the actual governor is Republican, just because that's sort of funny there. And the old chimney stacks of the early mills, of course. But this is it. So this is the smallest state capital in the United States. Once you come into town, if we're coming, because we've been coming from New Hampshire on this tour, you come down a beautiful hill into this spectacular environment. And then you wind up through all the maple forests up through here and into Stowe. And then you head off for Barrington or wherever you want to go to. But I think Montpelier is just a charming place. Concord, incidentally, down the road in New Hampshire would be the second smallest state capital. And then Cheyenne, Wyoming, of course, and Juneau, Alaska. But Juneau is a little different because it's the largest city in the United States. In case you don't know that, in terms of area, that's sort of fun. There is a sense of some of the views, and it is kind of that picturesque. Right? It's that wonderful mix, and it has to be your personal taste. But it's that wonderful mix between the wooden architecture and the brick, and then the lovely gold dome. So that is where Vermont decides its future and its decision. So it's a fun place, and it's attractive. And I just thought if we're going to give one quick shout out to Vermont, then I think this is a fair conversation to have. So let's carry on, and we're going to drive up out of town because it's maple syrup. It's the biggest producer in the United States. And it's so interesting because Vermont has this very close relationship with Quebec, which is the biggest maple syrup producer in the world. But they have sort of a maple syrup mafia up in Quebec. The government controls it, they hoard it. And so Vermont slides in through there. And of course, you do get the fabulous maple trees. I find there is something rather beautiful about being a maple syrup farmer because it's just so unoffensive as an activity. It's you tap the trees, you don't kill them, you cook it off, you share it, the leaves come down and you start another season. It's quite a beautiful, long-term sustainable product. I'm not sure you grow a massive industry off it anymore. but you do see in that mountainy area. And I say once you get north of Stowe, and there's some big peaks in Stowe. In fact, quite often there's this race in the ski industry to be which hill opens first every year. And you might think Colorado or the Rockies. Often they get the first enough accumulation up just north of Montpelier there to actually have downhill skiing. So that's really a fun thing to see. And again, I mentioned earlier, but the signage, there's this low key sort of refined nature to Vermont, which can be almost a little, I'd say Vermont has, if I were to pick a sort of negative, there can be a bit of an elitism to it. I was trying to find the statistic today, and I didn't find it, so I don't want to be misquoted, but I believe Vermont, it has, among the highest levels of education in the United States, and it did, at least at some point, and seeing as how we're all living through a pandemic, it had the highest rate of vaccination, whereas I think Mississippi or Alabama had the opposite. And you can see that sort of gap in views and participation in society and due diligence and governance and that sort of thing playing into that big picture. So I know, interesting concept about Vermont. So it's a small state and it punches above its weight. And if people think, it's so in the US context, so democratic, well, Wyoming's sort of so Republican, they kind of offset each other as sort of those small states in different parts of the country. So as I move on. Now, when I can see a broader map, to get down to Connecticut, you drive down through Massachusetts, through Western Massachusetts to get to Connecticut. So there's a fairly, which I showed at the beginning, a fairly distinct line where New England kind of stops and great, big, powerful, beautiful New York begins. And so Connecticut, you've really moved from that rolling mountain New England through Springfield and another university town, famously very progressive. I would say of all the states of New England, Connecticut's the one that I know the least about. I have driven through it several times, but on these tours, we tend to head down to Hartford, and I've been down all along the coast, of course, which is beautiful. But Connecticut is this interesting mix. I love the fact that it still has an indigenous name to it, Long Tidal River. But I'm sure, I expect this comes as a surprise to people, that it has the highest per capita income in the United States. And I believe it's the second highest human development index measure. So it's an interesting state. It's powerful economically, particularly for insurance, but also that mix of sort of classic New England. And in the early days of what is the United States, all these coastal states play a massive role in the formation of the country and the politics and the economy. And then after the development of things like air conditioning, a lot starts to shift southeast, Florida or Southwest Arizona. But these are these real fundamental 200-300 year development sectors of what is now, this most powerful country in the world. And so I do say that really New England meets New York because you have this big spillover. I mean, Long Island's just across the water, right? So, and of course, Long Island suddenly whole different identity. But the capital is Hartford. I have a lovely photo of Hartford, but I would say, with all due respect, Hartford takes a little bit of love. It's all to do with a series of zoning rules and so forth. And so Hartford itself can feel quite marginal, and it has a lot more of that almost Art Deco empire sort of architecture, which isn't what defines New England. So hopefully that makes some sense to you. And so it is a bit of a spillover, as I say, a big insurance center, and it's the capital of this very important, powerful state of several million people with a lot of money that deals with that greater New York economy, which is a massive economy. But the sort of ethnic mix here in Hartford is a different feel. But it is interesting to go back 100 years. I enjoy a night in a place like Hartford. I would say I've had groups that have come in and feel that it didn't, in all of New England for the most part, you feel like you go out walking at night. I mean, even Boston, a big city, I just feel so incredibly safe. Would say there's a bit of marginality there, whereas a coastal Connecticut is extremely wealthy and refined. So I just offer that as a bit of a commentary that's worth knowing. But the reason I wanted to highlight this, and I feel like I have to, is because of the Mark Twain house. Now, he was born in Missouri, Florida, Missouri, actually. I think probably most people know that, Samuel Clemens. But it wasn't until, and so I mean this as someone who was learning when I was doing a tour, the first time I ever ran a tour, and and it was interesting because a company had reached out to me and said, well, we want to do all 6 states. What should we put in? And I was Googling things and said, well, wow, Mark Twain lived for years in Connecticut. Let's go. And I try and say this, and I can name a few, but I think it is one of the very best small museum visits I've seen anywhere, certainly in North America, if not the world. I'll give you another great example would be Sun Studios down in Memphis, where rock and roll was born. Here's the father of American literature. And the guides, the interpreters who work here, so I don't want to steal their thunder. I am in 10 minutes not going to give you the big picture of Mark Twain and all of that, but to go and see this house and see what life is like in the late 1800s, 19th century, with someone who lived through the Civil War, saw enslavement, saw the effect of enslavement, saw himself transition through it, remained absolutely racist from all accounts to the indigenous people, obviously had a very structured world in terms of the way he saw the world, but the way his mind worked. And when you go through the quotes, you realize how his echo has infused our modern ability to form thought, to speak in an academic sense. So he really is important. You may or may not know a little bit about his life. I have a connection in my family history. This is recorded, so I don't want to get into names, but someone dear to me who has epilepsy, he actually lost a daughter in the bathtub to epilepsy. He hasn't ended up with a direct heir. He did bankrupt himself at one point, brought his money back by lecturing, paid off all his debts. But most of, if not all of his great novels were written when he lived here. And of course, we're still talking 19th century. So you're starting to move into the time of Edison, original light bulbs, but the early days would have been candles. But he's one of those rare authors. Mine don't count at all, but I've written a few books, but he was rich in his lifetime. Very rare as an artist and a creator. So there's the house. Now there's a museum down the side. You come in, you're guided through. There were helpers, of course, and again, huge amounts of money. You're just, if roughly, if you know Hartford, you drive from the city past the Capitol buildings for the state, and you get out to this neighborhood. What's amazing to me is now I've been here enough times that I don't necessarily take the tour. I send the group in and I'll go out walking because I try and do that. And it's actually quite a rough area now. It shows a bit of the marginality, but I'm just so impressed by what they run as a site here. So anyone who's on this conversation, who's close enough to get there, may I strongly encourage you to make the effort to get up and book a time and see this museum and be guided through, because it's full of thought. His contribution to literature is unbelievable. Whilst he was living there, so The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, The Prince and the Pauper, you can read it. Life on the Missouri, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, A Tramp Abroad, a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. But when Mara and I talked about doing this little conversation, I sat down and I was playing with quotes, and I knew I was going to say travel is fatal to prejudice. It's longer, and of course we're all talking travel, and I believe that. But this lies, damn lies, and statistics. I see that all the time. And just think back. I mean, maybe even if you put in the chat, I'm not looking at it as I'm presenting, but just think of how many quotes have come down. I mean, some of his about politics, right? I love this. If you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. I know that was Twain in my early days guiding tours. I don't know if it was, but I was reminded, don't lie on tour, because then you don't have to cover up for 10 days or 2 weeks, right? You don't know something, that's okay. If you get something wrong, that's okay. But the one that I always feel like I have to come back to is this different version, because as a child, for as far as I understand from the tours in this house, so I'm not claiming to be a literary expert here, but he was actually I wouldn't say pro, but not anti-enslavement. And are you aware, I presume, that we've really moved away from the term slavery? Now, obviously, we're looking at a 19th century quote here, but we try and avoid the term slavery now because you're not born a slave, you are enslaved. And the story of enslavement in North America, as opposed to, and you may or may not know this, but 48% of all enslaved people ended up in the Caribbean, 44% in Brazil, only about 5% in what were these British and French colonies. And incidentally, to my Canadian friends, there was enslavement in both French and English Canada. But it's the fact that life expectancy was a little better, and so people's children were bred. And one of the many articles I picked up at this museum, and I was looking around the house, but I couldn't find it, was one of his reflections on going to a market where enslaved people were being sold. But this quote here, the blunting effects of slavery upon the slaveholder's moral perception are known and conceded the world over. And a privileged class, an aristocracy, is but a band of slaveholders under a different name. Now, this is coming from an extremely privileged person, to be fair, privileged by his own success and this boom period after the American Civil War, which leads us to Rhode Island and Gilded Age and so forth. And nevertheless, to have that sort of vision and what he found himself going through this gradual epiphany of both the American experience and the Huckleberry Finn, the floating down the river, the disconnecting, that old, forgetting his name now, but that old concept of the independent person, that deep kind of libertarian thought that comes into sort of the American psyche. You have that one side, and then the other side, this incredibly controlled power structure, and the fact that 19th century conversation amongst this sort of ruling elite was quite scientifically driven, rather than necessarily religious driven. I think we forget that, the "In God We Trust" came in quite a lot later into kind of modern American politics. And so Twain does echo through, and I'm sure we can all name all sorts of other writers, but that's an important creature and a flawed human being with a terrible temper and all sorts of things, and why they do it so well here. So I find it reason enough just to travel down there. And then in Connecticut, you can carry on and you can travel down along the coast. I always try and get down to the coast to come in to beautiful, delicious Rhode Island, which is now, you may or may not know, as of a referendum or plebiscite last year, the state of Rhode Island. It was until 2020, the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. So the smallest state with the largest name. And that was always just a great quiz question. But they've changed their name because the concept of plantations is a very, very important acknowledgement of the history of enslavement, which infused what is now New England as much as it infused other parts of the states. And even if, and there were in the important wealthy places, loads of enslaved people, it was also the slave trade, right? So Salem, which I mentioned very briefly on the next bit, Salem was, of course, the witch trials and the Atlantic trade, but that's slave trade, right? It's banished by the French Empire in the 1790s, by the British Empire in the 1830s, but they kept trading. And of course, the United States at the end of the Civil War, so 1864, 65 is important. 1860s, by the way, in the Netherlands too. It's often not talked about, but little Rhode Island, and it's a treat. I remember the first time I went there. Of all of New England, I think I have my richest connection to Rhode Island, and that's because when I began guiding tours, I was based in Europe, and I was Dad was Irish, so I had the passport, and there were groups from Rhode Island, and they are to this day. In fact, some of them might be on here. Personal friends, and I just love the state. I love the people. I love the accent, and I even love the mix, because as soon as you get into this part of New England, you're suddenly picking up a really important Portuguese influence and an Italian influence, very important in Rhode Island. The accent does change. So I always think of Connecticut, and I get gross generalizations, but quite Anglo-Saxon, and then the other movements. And then you get in, of course, to fabulous Rhode Island itself. And it is interesting, the first colony, Rhode Island was born out of religious disagreements, but the establishment of something apart from Pilgrim, Massachusetts, and that's how they fuse this little state together. But of course, it wasn't small at the time, because look at the coastline. When your whole life is maritime. Now remember, when we were back up in Vermont, you're playing a whole mountain river culture. Here, it's all maritime, right? So very important. But this little state, about 1.1, 1.2 million people, is the second most densely populated state in the United States. Doesn't feel it when you come in this side. Certainly when you come down from Boston, it does. The most populated state, I'm sure you know, but is New Jersey. Right? But down at the bottom is on Narragansett Island, which is actually an island, but you have Newport, famous for America's Cup and money and the Gilded Age. So this is where wealthy New York escaped. Now, do remember back to where we started up, and this is a little bit why I chose the places I did, but we were up in Acadia, and that was really the benevolence of the Rothschild family. Well, you're in Vanderbilt country here, and the amount of money is probably, they're still wealthier than the Bezos of today, and the Microsoft and so forth. So that money and so much of how we understand the modern United States was the benevolence of that incredible money there. So it was the first state to renounce allegiance to the British Crown, and then the last to ratify it. And I really think that stands for a lot. I had to show you the breakers. You can do a tour of it. The tours are excellent. You hold a little phone and they're in every language you want. And of course, where I'm standing here behind me is water breaking. But this is that elite post-Civil War up to World War I, that 50 years of obscene wealth as the Industrial Revolution booms through the United States. This was their summer retreat. It also caused massive immigration into the state because all of these houses required so much staff. And that's where you suddenly see your Irish, your Portuguese, your French Canadians, your people of color, and even an African-American school, and therefore a wing of the KKK, which moved into what is now liberal, lovely little Rhode Island to keep an eye on them. So, and they had to keep the houses ready to go in case the families arrived on any day. So, interesting bit of history there. But what I wanted to mention, there's just a nice view. I mean, Newport is of course extremely wealthy. It's gorgeous. It's, of course, a sailing capital. They have the old forts from both defending British Empire and then defending the United States from the British, and a huge mix, of course, of maritime culture. And it's one of those places that truly international, which I don't belong to, and I doubt any of us do, but the people who sail around the world, this is a place you call into, right? And we can name them. But this is what I wanted to mention here, and I think it's important at all sorts of levels. The very first time I went to Newport, I had been to Rhode Island a few times. And the very first time I came down, I knew that there had been a principally Sephardic population, of course, through New England. Incidentally, on my mom's side, we have an Ashkenazi link, a direct link. But I come around the corner, and this is the oldest synagogue building. Now, one can debate in terms of congregations and ones that are built, destroyed, and so forth. But this is understood to be the first synagogue in the United States. And that's pretty remarkable. Not incredibly remarkable, on a very, very important natural bay. You have the bay there. You had the bay at Boston. Remember, there was no channel cut yet through Cape Cod. And then as you get up the coast, you really don't have a good bay because the Bay of Fundy was useless, the biggest tides in the world, all the way around to Halifax and then Cape Breton. So this was an important trading place, and then moving down into the Hudson where New York is. But very, very interesting to see, founded 1658. I mean, those are early days, right? And it's early days to have both a Jewish congregation and one that clearly felt happy enough to be there or safe enough, dedicated in 1763. And you'll notice here Washington's visit in 1781. So do the math, right? You have Rhode Island and Providence plantations, the colony, pull out, denounce its loyalty, but take a long time to buy into these United States. And I always think that's an important injunction. Often when talked about, they'll say the United States is only a post-Civil War function, but these United States is but happily the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. Extremely important. There's, unfortunately, I'm not thrilled with the photo I was able to find and use because of copyright, but there it is. And it's lovely. And it's just from where the visitor center is in Newport. You go around two bends and you're there. And unassuming and attractive. And it has almost that early Presbyterian austere element to its architecture that is endemic very much to New England in many ways, but there's the synagogue. But what I thought would be fun to share with everyone is the letter. And why I think this letter is very important is George Washington writes to the congregation in Newport, but he had visited years earlier. He writes the 18th of August, 1790, and that is because Rhode Island had just signed on as the 13th state. So it is as much a welcome and a respectful statement as it is as well, congratulations, we're all in this together. So, and it's, I think it's a really interesting thing. I don't need to use up your time and just sit here and read it to you. But the citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. Right? And when you're looking at, so 1789 is really the second American Constitution. And they're really setting out what liberal democracy looks like in this modern world. So feel free to Google it or go back and read it. But it's pretty significant that saying that, first of all, people of non, and remember, New England, of course, and accepting, and I don't want to accept the indigenous people because that's another whole conversation, but accepting them was actually built on both the idea of religious freedom and in its own way a certain intolerance, but they had the space to do it. And Washington and so forth in the early, and they got a lot of things wrong. I mean, a lot of things wrong in the early writing, but they had a sense that they were building a mosaic. And part of that were people of Jewish culture, belief, heritage, well, ethno-cultural background. And that has carried on and become extremely important. So I think it's a really relevant thing. And I think Newport, Rhode Island is worth talking about that. I feel like I have a lot more to talk about Rhode Island itself, but I always just think that's fantastic. And I'm more intrigued by something like this, and that little building, than I am by those giant mansions. You know, I've spent my whole life traveling the world, and I have come to learn that rich people have big houses. So, you know, that's a, whereas something like this is a real statement on community and building a society. Now, we move on. There's Providence, right? The capital of Rhode Island. You're really with no traffic, roughly an hour up to Boston. You know, you're looking at nearly 7 million people in Massachusetts, of which way more than half are part of this catchment of greater Boston. If New England were to be a single country, Boston is overwhelmingly the capital. You're only really, again, with no traffic, a few hours down to even New York, but Boston's its own feel. Love Boston. And as I say, I would like to hand that over to, and I know people for Mara's sake who are guides there, you know, it's a big conversation. Do notice I mentioned Salem earlier, but it's absorbed really. It actually takes from city center of Boston about an hour with traffic to go with a tour coach to get up there. And then boom, you're right up into to New Hampshire, up that coast there. Now, I just to come back for a minute, we had traveled down from Vermont through Northampton, which is Smith's University, Springfield into Hartford. And I went down the coast after Mark Twain's house, down into here and cut across into Newport over these huge bridges. Although I love Providence too. I find it a very attractive city, and Barrington up north here, but again, you can't have them all. And then you get up to Boston. But I thought when I was handed magnificent Massachusetts and all the culture and the diversity and everything, I felt that I just couldn't ignore Cape Cod, because otherwise it has to go on forever. And Cape Cod, and particularly Provincetown, for a whole plethora of reasons. But this is my funnest thing ever. And I have done, in fact, a few years ago, I ran a tour that was just Cape Cod. We did a Boston City tour, went to Cape Cod for a week. Are you ready for a map of Cape Cod, everyone? Here you go. There's Cape Cod. So Boston's my ear. You go down, there's a canal right through here, Plymouth, which, you know, you claim, but then out to the corner, Chatham on the corner, where now they're actually getting great white sharks. And then right up past Truro up to the top to little Provincetown, little wild, diverse Provincetown. Falmouth on the bottom, incidentally, 10 out of 10, gorgeous. They have all the protected architecture on Cape Cod, very strict rules about the height of buildings. But Cape Cod is geographically, physically, a little different than the rest of New England, but it's created because of New England. So way back, I showed you the panoramic of the geology. The glaciers are seeded about 11,000 years ago. And this effect called isostatic rebound comes up, the world bounces up. That's why Niagara Falls are there. Creates this disequilibrium between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. Well, all of this on the coastal side washes out to the Atlantic Ocean. What does it do? It washes out this whole sandy basin in here. Now, we're all aware that the Pilgrims come into Plymouth, right? And last year, they were getting all set up. Of course, I was going to be there for the 400 years. And of course, I couldn't because I couldn't travel. But their first stop was actually Provincetown. This bay for 200 years was whaling. That wasn't much fun for the whales, I assure you. Whales were used, of course, for oil in lights, well, really around the world. So, you know, that was a lot of the economy. But the Pilgrims come in here and then go across. But Provincetown, the way these very far-flung, interesting little places. And I could go on and on about Cape Cod. I was tempted to do a whole Cape Cod talk, but then I'd have to talk about Sandwich, and I'd have to go on about Yarmouth and say Chatham down here, Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. And I have spent quite a bit of time over on Martha's Vineyard, very flat again. It's a sandy, but it's why you've got these granite mountains there has washed out to here. So it's a logical effect. So when you drive all the way up, it's a double lane, a 4-lane highway right out to the elbow, and then you get down into 1 lane as you go up. And Provincetown, I cannot recommend enough, but don't try and drive back to Boston on a Sunday night. I mean, what should be 3 hours becomes 6, but it's a tiny permanent community, 3,000, 3,500 people. That, by the way, is the library. It has a ship inside. I just didn't find a good place to put the photo. A very distinct Portuguese background. This monument, so 272 feet, built in the early 1900s. There's quite a few, of course. In Plymouth, there's another one, the Founders Memorial. You can pick 100 things to give a talk about, but this stands, of course, out here in this very sandy area. The far side of it is generally protected marshland because it catches the weather as it comes in, so that you build on the insular side, the inside of the bend. But this old, isolated fishing community, where, of course, straight across to sell things and market over in Boston, has turned now into one of the, well, there you have a sense of that spit of land, and then you see part of the Cape way in the distance, in Boston would be way back there. So small and lovely and windblown and warm enough to swim in for some of the year at least. But as happens in these sort of societies, and you may know where I'm going with this conversation, is it has become one of the most liberal communities in the United States. In fact, I believe it claims to have the highest percentage of same-sex couples of any community in the United States. So old Portuguese, mostly from the Azores, fishing people, weekenders who come out, and it's created this incredibly diverse community. And now it is a center of arts. In fact, one time I was there, actually the first time I was there, I walked down the street, there was a sign that said Cuban Art Gallery, and I went in, and it's actually art from Cuba. And I ended up bringing some of those people on a trip to Cuba because I take groups there. I'm allowed to as a Canadian. And you will see rainbow flags absolutely everywhere. If that's something that's, we've all moved on, I think, so much in North America. My son is 15, and he grew up in a world where equal marriage is just part of our lives, and I'm proud of that. But in the early days, this was cut off the road, a little bit like Key West as well. And I think a lot of people spend their summers working here in that community, and then they'll go down to Key West, which is also known as a very liberal same-sex sort of environment. And so it's this really wild sort of party environment, extremely expensive as a downside, just because you have people come from all over, and this wonderfully intense artistic community. I don't know a lot of people there, but I've contacted a few through the pandemic, a bit like living in Banff here, where, I mean, we had unemployment of 85% at one point when we were locked off. I would expect a community like this went through something similar. But it's absolutely a lifestyle choice. I think the Cape is a lifestyle choice in the winter too, for people who like that isolation and that sense of separation. And of course, throughout the Cape, you have these old Cape Cod protected homes and that clapboard style, which I find gorgeous, and I think most people do. But there you have a sense. It is just fun. Maybe a little wild for me, but it is a fun place. And of course, when you're out there, which anywhere along the coast, you're back into eating the fabulous seafood, that fun sort of partying, friendly, but also because there's this really intense arts community there, that really plays into a lot of what's happened culturally. There's a ferry, there's even flights, but there's a ferry that comes zooming over from Boston. Boy, I wouldn't want to be doing that in a gale, but it can happen. And out in the water, you can go whale watching, and you can see fin whales, which are second or third largest whales in the world. turn on their side, they have a white strip. It's really rather spectacular. And I'm glad the world's moved beyond the whaling industry, but out on the outer coast of it, of course, they are seeing more and more of these sharks, which shouldn't be in these waters, but the waters have warmed. But so P-Town, I guess if I'm going to just pick a fun shout out, I'll call the Cape altogether. There's 2 bridges that go over, which was built in the early 1900s, the canal through into Bedford, so the economics coming through the area. But the Cape is its own identity, and as those sort of places are, each community has its identity in there. So that brings us up to just an overall, 6 spots. And I say when Mara and I had talked about it, we thought we'd pick 1 spot in each state. I'm happy to talk more. Again, I don't want to be an oracle of everything, but I want to share the fact that I've led many, many tours in that area. This is a meal I just had to put up. This happened to be on Cape Cod in Falmouth. It was sort of a last night dinner that I had with a group from Europe. And they actually cut open the lobster for all of them, but they told me that I had to eat my own. Now, I'm not famously a particularly big eater, but the food is just so yummy. And of course it's rich. I'm a 1 meal a day guy down there. If you don't want to dig the whole lobster open, then go for a lobster roll. If you're vegetarian, they've got potatoes and corn. But let me, we'll just leave it there for the moment. Mara, thank you. I'm more than happy. Have a little drink of juice here. And open it up for questions.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. I think that it was exactly as you say. It was a highlights tour, so we have to appreciate the fact that you had to choose favorite spots in those areas. It was great to see that many people learned some new things about this region, and obviously there's some bigger in-depth diving that can be done in all of those states, but it gives you a taste. So if you liked particular areas, you can explore them more. I'm going to give Patrick a moment to start looking at the Q&A so that we can address that. I put up a slide just now, which essentially kind of tells you how you can tip the tour director if you are so inclined. I have several ways. On my website also is a secure way to provide a credit card or PayPal, but you can also use Venmo or some of your apps that are on the mobile devices as well. I also am listing on the right-hand side now my physical tours. If you do have an interest in joining us and one of our groups on a tour coming up, just send me an email at marawalsh@gmail.com and I can provide you with pricing or information and itineraries so that you can gauge if any of them are of interest to you. So Patrick, if you are ready, we're going to go and attack the Q&A. Sure. And you can kind of take it from the top and see where you want to go from there. And we can dive in. You let me know when you're ready.
Well, no, I'm here. I see some questions, or would you like to send them to me, or do you want me to just respond to these ones?
You can dive in if you'd like.
Okay. Well, Christina said, what are the best historical places here? Honestly, it's just too big a question. It's the most, in terms of European settlement, it's the most historical part of the United States just by sheer age. Depends where you want to go. I think Plymouth is a very good place to start when you talk about the settlement. Boston is, of course, just seeping with history and energy. I'm a huge fan of that coast up in Maine, but honestly, it's just too big a question. Verona, yeah, the Old Man of the Mountain Fell. Yeah, I think I said 2003. Yeah, so the replica, I've seen actually, the hologram sounds lovely. I've seen Rona in the Flume Gorge, which is really right across from where the Old Man of the Rock there in the Notch. I've taken groups in there. One time, Rona, I was there when there was so much rain, they couldn't go into the gorge, so we all just watched the movie. But that one gentleman, I've forgotten his name, who spent his whole life cleaning it, and it was heartbreaking for him. But yeah, I mean, that's just erosion, but I do love driving up through that. It's such a, living here in the Rockies, I talk so much about glacial valleys. They're U's, not V's. River valleys are a V. So when I was showing Montpelier, that's that kind of V, whereas the big broad U. So yeah, thank you for that, Rona. And I love Maine. The Von Trapps do have a hotel in Stowe, Catherine, and I have not stayed there, but I have eaten there. So yeah, it's up the hill. And I tend to work with tour companies a bit like the EF stuff, which I'm a huge fan of travel being accessible to everyone. It tends to be a little more elite, but it's lovely through there. Rehad's asked about colleges. Well, everywhere. I mean, it's the center of education in the US. Just around Boston is, of the big cities, the most educated in the United States. So Harvard and MIT are really, self-evident, but you actually have the Ivy League, right, which is 4. So Connecticut in this house. So I'm not sure. Connecticut is where Mark Twain was in this. The capital is Hartford, right in the middle. It's really the most square and the most westerly of them. If that's your question, Ron, I'm happy to answer. Yep. Now, Leslie's asking, I will be in Acadia in mid-September for days. Is the loop the most? Okay, Leslie, I honestly believe that in Acadia, I could spend probably 5 days. So if you have time, because you have to allow for a bit of weather as well, do go out. And I don't always believe in the tours, but do go out on one of the lobster boats because they're local as well. And they have that bahaba. They've got that real, I just love the accent, and they're as friendly as you expect. You drive the loop. And if you're in your car, you do get a permit, leave as early as you can and circle around and get up to Cadillac Mountain, because the road can actually be so full. But when you come back down, and if you loop again without going up to Cadillac, that South Shore is fantastic. And there's real cliff edges, safe, but do watch where you're going. But what's so nice about it, because it's sea level and generally it's granite, if it's not wet, it's actually really good walking. And if you stay in Bar Harbor, when you go to the back of town, you can actually go walking right into the park on your own. So Acadia is easy. There's the old tea house. There's one of the lodges that's inside. If there's a cruise ship or something on it, as much as I love it, skip it, because a cruise ship comes in and 5,000 people are taken off the ship and it fills it all up. Was this one of the many pieces of correspondence actually penned by Alexander Hamilton? I don't know, V. Thanks for asking. I wouldn't be surprised. I'd have to Google that myself. But I mean, you're talking about the creation of what we know as the United States today. So excellent question. No, well worth asking. Yeah, well, the Portuguese women, Sharon, is they had this massive migration. So it's funny, I didn't actually mention it, but 20% of New Hampshire has Irish heritage and 19.8% of Massachusetts. But in a meaningful way, South Boston is the Irish capital of the United States. Again, my father was an Irishman. I have a bias towards it, but also some pretty rough history, right? We talk about it. But then you had this massive migration that came in, particularly from the Azores, but also from mainland Portugal and Madeira. And they were fishing people. And they came over and they fished. Remember, the whole coast, really from that, I mean, you can even go down as far as the Carolinas, but New England's fishing all the way up into Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and of course, Newfoundland, which was the center of the cod fishery. And so it was Portuguese migration. And when I meet people from Bedford specifically, which is Massachusetts, but right on the border with Rhode Island, I think it is still predominantly Portuguese. So that's why you have the image of the Portuguese women, and you'll see this. Fall leaves, Jan. It's a lose-lose, but when you hit it, it's incredible. So for over 10 years, I have done some version of New England and Canada, 6 states in the fall. And if you have an early winter, mid-September, fantastic. It can be as late as October. The reason why I believe in a 2-week trip down there, if really colors, if the coast is still green, they'll be changing inland. If you're seeing twigs when you're in the White Mountains, get to the coast and they'll be popping out. The elevation change. So it's that mid-September right up to later October is that window. And it really depends where you go. And when you drive in, so let's say you've flown into Boston, when you drive into New Hampshire, go and get a leaf identifier. You know, the 3 types of maples, the incredible reds, but they all pop out. It is luck of the draw. but it is magnificent, Laurie. So I'm happy. Is there any historical significance of the Berkshires? Oh yes, yeah. I mean, Berkshires again is historic. You see generally in New England, with some exceptions, either very Englishy names, and Berkshire is, or indigenous names, of course. But the Berkshires was also money a little bit later on. So a carry on after really that Gilded Age. So I think, Laurie, that's the tour of the Mark Twain House, Jean, is, I just honestly cannot recommend it enough. I think when I take groups there, it takes us several hours because I have to separate them. But I think they take a maximum of 12 people. It's because the guides are so informed there. And it's not that guides aren't informed elsewhere, but they just do such an excellent job, and they've known their literature. They start you out with a film, they take you through the house, they explain what it was like living, but then climb into who he was as a writer, and really quite a distinctly tragic family. But on your own, you're in and out in about an hour, and down the road from the capital. Marblehead, Mass Christie, I would have to Google it. Is that out by Rockport? I'd have to look, sorry. Yeah, we're moving through this, but Marblehead, Mass. Let me see on the map if I've been there. Oh, yes, I have, absolutely. Absolutely, I have. When I've done tours into Salem, then if we've been early, we've driven around that bend in there and then out to Rockport that way. So lovely. Sorry, Karen, if I said 1983, I mean 2003. Thanks for correcting me. Yeah. Worcester, Mass. Well, if it's Worcester's inland, yes. So yes, absolutely. I find the foliage or foliage, as I'd say, but the foliage is spectacular up the hillsides and then right out on the coast. So, oh yeah, and the Connecticut coast, there's a reason why it's some of the most expensive real estate in the United States, of course. Yeah, and this is where, I mean, you can explore these. There's a reason why there's 3 centuries of history in these places. So, so there's so much up and down that coast. I would think that Connecticut, to me, if you're really doing the Connecticut coast, you're either tying to a trip, because there is a ferry from Long Island or New York, and you're heading up maybe to Boston, you're taking a coastal route. To really spend time on that coast, if you're focusing on kind of broader New England, Maine becomes a long way away. So that was all I would offer on that sense. But where would you recommend flying into for start and ending in Boston? So you can either do Boston to Boston, which is very easy, but it's in Portland. They don't call it an airport; they call it an airdrome or something. It's a lovely little airport. So Portland is perfectly good into, but honestly, if you're going to fly in and rent a car, just fly into Boston. Knowing that, of course, they have the big dig, they have all these tunnels all through, and when you drive down underneath Boston, if there's a brown line, you're in land, and if there's a blue line, you're underwater. But have a good GPS, because Boston, you will get so lost in. Have I been to Weston Priory in Vermont? No, I have not, Suze. Thanks for asking. Have you ever thought of an author's tour of New England? Oh, I have. The problem is, Carol, yes, it's Irving is Vermont, and I mean it's a writer's paradise. It is a remarkable. Whether you're going to take a group for a true, Walden Pond. I have heard. I have actually had small family connection. Has a place on Peabody Lake up north of Portland in Maine. So I'm a little more personally familiar than maybe I let on in these tours. But to be there in late fall and listen to the call of the loon is pretty magical. So yeah, it crosses my mind. I mean, it's an author's part of the world. So thanks, Carol. Absolutely. Jean, have you ever visited Harry Beach Stowe House? That is, I know what it is, but no, I haven't visited. Nope, Jean, I've literally gone in several times to Hartford and sort of pulled off a bit of a tour for the bit I've learned about it, and then been to Mark Twain. So thanks, Rona. I think that's really good advice there. They're saying people should call ahead. It's the sunrise particularly. Yeah, it's I did a hike up for sunrise, which is a hike and a half. But yeah, it has gotten busier. I can tell you, Rona, that the last 2 times I've been to Acadia, there have been bus companies out of Boston, nice guys, New Englanders, but there's a whole separate permit thing, and I've had to go and get permits. And in fact, the building where you get the permit, they've actually closed down the visitor center, moved you in. So there's lots going on. I appreciate the advice because I'm scared to talk too much about it in this day and age, because of course I haven't been able to travel for a year and a half. Hyannis Port, yeah, Hyannis is fantastic, Sue. So Hyannis is where I have every time taken I've taken the boat ferry over to Martha's Vineyard, like the foot ferry from Falmouth, and Hyannis is where I've gone over, of course, and I've taken a bus over several times. So yeah, yes, I have. Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire is the lake right by just north of Concord, I believe, unless I'm gorgeous place, Marie. Love that area, and that would be if I'm coming in from Boston, I go to Concord, I'm heading up to North Conway, and then I would go across Kancamangas as I head up towards Stowe. Carrie, great question, thank you. I'm trying to remember the name. So I'm a little biased because I'm a bit of a Quebec guy when it comes to maple syrup, but when you're just coming up and out of Montpelier, I'd have to Google the name, but I have and they're lovely people too. Sorry, the name is escaping me right now. I could probably Google it, but right there. And not only do they do good tours, they happen to actually just be really lovely people as well. So I love bringing them a business and I enjoy them. The name, as soon as we cut off, the name will come to me. But
doesn't that always happen? The question was, where can you visit for a maple syrup farm? So
just outside Montpelier. Yep.
Just exactly. So Google it, just outside Montpelier in Vermont, and you'll find the farm that Patrick is trying to rack his brain to remember.
But and I think dotted all over. Yeah.
That's really wraps up our Q&A, Patrick. We've had so many people that have said thank you for your time, thank you for your expertise, and also thank all of you out there for joining us. So we really do appreciate you coming on week after week and experiencing these locations with us. So from me to everybody else and to Patrick, thank you again. And we will see you all next week. Take care.